question of what it was like to be poor in London before the establishment of the welfare state fascinates researchers of all kinds. The social and financial safety nets in place today rest on modern philosophical, political, and economic beliefs that everyone in society should be able to expect a safe and reasonably comfortable existence. In this talk, we're looking back to a time when the workhouse was a part of life for many Londoners, a time when day-to-day income insecurity was the norm, and when you would have been amongst the majority in being relatively, if not absolutely poor. As an indispensable primary source, poor law records tell us not only about people who fell on hard times in the past, but also about the efforts to address their needs. These records now form significant archive collections, which, although really valuable, are not always easy to navigate. In this session, I'm going to introduce some of the material that we hold at London Metropolitan Archives and explore some ways in which researchers can access these rich sources of information. Whether the subject is new to you or you're a veteran user of such records, I hope to show how understanding the nature of poor law records can help you both identify them in catalogues and get the most out of them in your research. When I'm preparing a talk about our archive holdings, I like to try and get an estimate of how many items of archive material relate to the subject at hand. So we hold about 30 collections which are actually classified as poor law Boards of Guardians collections. However, there are at least 75 major collections that contain material relating to London welfare provision before 1948. These include collections from local government and also charitable welfare bodies, such as this one, the Soup Kitchen for the Jewish Poor. When I searched our catalogue for the term workhouse, I got 7,258 items. But finally I got a staggering 354 hits when I searched for Board of Guardians. So I've had to be quite selective about the type of material I'll be able to talk to you about today by way of introducing this big subject to you. As with most of the talks that we do at LMA, the information I'm sharing today closely reflects sources that are freely available online. This includes our online research guide, Poor Law Records in London and Middlesex, which you can see here, and also our catalogue, where you'll find detailed information on all our collections. Also, all of the images that I'm using today are from the London Picture Archive, LMA's online image database. So let's get started now by looking at the historical background to the creation of these records. In this section, I'm going to outline the nature of the English poor laws and describe how they came about. This will include looking at the role of the overseers of the poor and the guardians. I'll also talk about the institutions and services that are associated with poor law provision and the nature of poor relief. If you only remember one date associated with poor law history, it would be good to make it 1834, because it marks the point between what is known as the old poor law system and the new poor law system. With the passing of the Poor Law Amendment Act in this year, a major revision of the system was implemented, which started to shift from local to statewide provision for those in hardship. So let's see first what the system was like before 1834. It may surprise you to know that up to 1834, the system for providing for the poor was based on laws enacted in the 1600s. Obviously, many reviews went on in the intervening period, including a parliamentary inquiry in 1777, but the core features of the system endured into the 19th century. Before 1834, the system was localised, with each civil parish taking responsibility for its own poor. Help could be in the form of financial support or essential supplies, and that was called out relief, but it could mean being taken into the poorhouse or the workhouse, and this was known as indoor relief. This was not just for people who were too old or too young to care for themselves, or for people who were sick or entirely destitute. It was also for people who simply could not put a roof over their heads, even if only temporarily. Each year, the parish had to elect their overseers of the poor, subject to the approval of the local justice of the peace. The overseers had responsibility to manage every aspect of the system. They decided who was given help, they raised local taxes to pay for it, and they had to deal with how the whole community felt about providing for the poor. These positions weren't popular, but every man with any standing in the parish was expected to take their turn. Eligibility for poor relief hinged upon your official local connection, known as your right of settlement. Being born and bred within a parish boundary was the most straightforward way of gaining this right, but there were other ways of qualifying. These included being married to a settled parishioner or being resident in the area for a prescribed period of time. Overseers looked out for people moving into the parish with the intention, perhaps, of seeking help after a qualifying period. The parish also had responsibility for arranging apprenticeships of poor children, and this was not just for orphans. Children could be placed locally or perhaps farther afield. The experiences of these children varied very widely, and exploitation was always a risk. So for over 200 years, this was the broad outline of poor relief in the UK. And it's not hard to imagine how variable the provision was in different parts of the country, or even from one parish to another. Here we see an image from 1797 of the Bow Workhouse, presented as a rather smart if austere establishment. In the Parliamentary Review of 1777, it was estimated that over 1,900 workhouses were in operation in England, and that some 90,000 paupers were being accommodated across them. In the 1830s, it was clear that this local parish-based system could no longer cope, especially in the rapidly growing cities and towns. So with the passing of the Poor Law Amendment Act in 1834, the authorities were charged with getting up to speed. While the provision of out relief and workhouse accommodation continued after the passing of the Act, the major change at this time was the official grouping of neighbouring parishes into poor law unions. Some voluntary unions had existed before 1834, but the new unions were each run by an elected board of guardians rather than the overseers, and the guardians reported to a new national panel of poor law commissioners. Edwin Chadwick was the first secretary of the Poor Law Commissioners. He was the great social and sanitary reformer of the period. And the commissioners themselves reported in turn directly to government. Importantly, the principle of your right of settlement remained as a central plank of the new system, but the way that the different boards applied the rules varied considerably. It was sometimes impractical and too costly to return people to their places of origin, for example, if they would temporarily lost their income. The Victorian Workhouse has been portrayed as harsh, stark, even cruel. Whilst people would not have been encouraged to seek help in case it served as an incentive, the issue of whether there was actually an intention to punish people for turning to the authorities is debatable. In terms of policy direction, the new poor law can be viewed as a step towards a more centralised, state-led welfare system. In the 1930s, national insurance scheme for workers had been introduced, and the workhouses had been taken over by the county councils to run as public institutions, public assistance institutions. But it remains the case that the English poor laws were on statute until 1948, when they were finally superseded by the National Insurance Act. So, how can an understanding of the English poor laws help researchers in any practical way? After all, aren't all the available London records indexed and available on Ancestry? Well, a tremendous amount of work has been done to make it easy as possible to locate and access the records you might be looking for, but stumbling blocks still exist. Here's an example of how changes in the system can sometimes impact on record finding. This image here is from 1939, and it's of a 98-year-old gentleman who was at that time resident in a place called Marylebone Institution. I've decided to call him Mr. Smith because we don't know what his name is, and he looks like a rather dignified gentleman. However, before the 1930s, this establishment would have been known as Marylebone Workhouse. When he was born, the workhouse would have been run by St Marylebone Board of Guardians, and we hold a collection of records for the board which dates from 1834. However, if this gentleman's ancestors had been in receipt of poor relief before 1834, any surviving records for this establishment might well be with St Marylebone Parish Collection in the Overseers of the Poor's records. So I think it's clear that an understanding of the administrative history of the poor laws can be helpful in navigating these archive collections, which can span over very long periods. So that's been a jog through the absolute basics of poor law history, and some of you will want to find out more. I can recommend firstly the pages on Peter Higginbotham's authoritative Workhouses website, where you'll find sections on all aspects of the poor law, and even, if you need them, full texts of the Poor Law Acts themselves. Secondly, the National Archives has detailed research guides on many aspects of the subject. You'll also find references in our online catalogue to the histories of the individual London poor law bodies that created all of the records that we hold. So it's time to look at some of the records that the poor law authorities produce, starting with board minutes. This image here is of the offices of Holborn Board of Guardians, and it happens to be just around the corner from London Metropolitan Archives. This building doesn't really strike you as a place where very interesting documents would have been created. And it's true that a lot of very routine business was done at board meetings. However, researchers familiar with board minutes tell us of discovering unexpected insights into the lives of those in receipt of poor relief, and those providing it. For example, at a meeting of the Holborn Board on the 15th of June 1836, the members dealt first with the accounts. Total expenditure for the week in out relief payments had totaled nearly £40. Another £76 was agreed to cover the cost of provisions for the workhouse, to pay the printer, and to pay Mr. Davis, who was the local slop seller. Now, I had to look up slop seller, and this apparently refers to the supply of rough, ready-made work clothes and other gear, perhaps purchased for workhouse inmates and for the staff. The board went on to announce the final approval of their appointments by the Poor Law Commissioners of England. They also announced that new masters and matrons had been taken on to run 2 of the workhouses, and these were husband and wife teams, which was quite a common practice at the time. But at the same meeting, the Guardians heard a report from the Visiting Committee for the Union's Infant Poorhouse, based out in Leafy Barnet. Here we can see part of the record of what they told the meeting. So the Visiting Committee said that they found the children in excellent condition as to their general health, and from their appearance and from answers to the questions put to them, the committee cannot doubt they are amply supplied with food of good quality and that they were sufficiently and properly clothed. The committee was worried, however, to hear that almost every child admitted to the infant poorhouse was either suffering from ringworm on arrival or showed signs of having had it previously. At one of the other children's homes used by the board, there'd been a case of scrofula too, and many of the children reported suffering from sore eyes. The concern was about possible contagion, but it was thought that this was actually down to the work of sorting bristles, which the children were employed in. This is only a fraction of the information contained in the minutes and of this one meeting, but from it we learn how involved the board was in the details of daily service provision. By the way, the medical officer got a severe slap on the wrist for not highlighting the ringworm problem sooner, but there seemed a lot less concern about the effect of the bristle sorting on these children's eyes. It's also not uncommon for individual recipients of relief to be mentioned in board minutes. Firstly, I'd just like to apologise for the slightly blurry nature of this slide. I hope you'll be able to see it well enough, but I'm going to comment on it now. So this is a note from a meeting of the Board of Guardians for Southwark from around the same time as the last meeting. And at this meeting, they made a decision that Sarah Joyce, who'd already been admitted to the workhouse, could continue to stay there. Also that Mary Chick should receive both a cash payment and an allowance of bread each week. Outdoor relief of 8p, 3 farthings in kind was agreed for Richard Runacre, which could be redeemed in goods locally. But I was also surprised about the reference in these minutes to the granting of a loan of 20 shillings to Henry Dixon from St Saviour's Parish. That was part of the Union for Southwark. The impression we perhaps get from the English poor laws is that they were only about doling out a kind of charity. Giving loans rather than grants may have reflected an understanding that people's needs for financial support could be temporary, as the availability of different types of work ebbed and flowed in local areas. What remains interesting, though, is the size of that loan, and you know, that would be very interesting to see. We could find out what he was using that money for. The board minutes were part of the way that the Poor Law Guardians accounted for their activities, and the inclusion of the names of these individual paupers is just part of the bigger picture being presented at meetings. Poor Law board minutes don't feature in our collections on Ancestry, mostly because of the challenge of indexing them for family history. They can, of course, be read very easily in digital format, and there are a few examples in the digital document collection in our catalogue, and that's what one of these is what this slide refers to. So this is an opportunity for me to do a little bit of advocacy on behalf of the humble Board of Guardians Minute Book. Underused and with undoubted research potential, they are well worth considering if you're looking for sources about the treatment of poor or less well-off Londoners before the middle of the 20th century. When on-site archival research becomes fully available again, although this may be some months away, many of the sets of Board of Guardians minutes in our collection will be available for general access again. So next I'm going to move on to what is probably the most commonly used poor law records in our collections, and that is admission and discharge records. This is a view from our catalogue of a typical Board of Guardians collections, in this case from Southwark Board. And you'll see highlighted a series of records entitled Workhouses and Institutions, and this is where you'll find the admission and discharge records. A number of different parishes came together to form Southwark Union, namely St George's, St Mary and Christchurch. And in this view of the catalogue, you can see a list of the first 10 admission and discharge registers from Christchurch Workhouse. The most common way of accessing the workhouse admission and discharge records at LMA is to use our collections on ancestry.co.uk. This is a subscription-based service for anyone not on site, but the main advantage, of course, is of being able to search for people by name. You can use the general search form to search all the collections on the LMA Ancestry homepage at the same time. Or, as shown here, you can use the dedicated search form which is provided for each of the individual collections. Which you choose depends on what information you already have and what you're looking for. You'll notice on the right-hand side of the window that you're offered a chance to browse through this collection rather than use the search function. And that's one of the options that you get if you use the dedicated search form associated with each collection. Now I'm going to take you through a short story which I found in these records of a young woman who needed to use this workhouse in 1919. Here are the results for a search that I did on a name chosen at random, which was Rogers. Based on the birth year, 1899, I can see that there are 2 discharges and 1 admission, which are probably for the same woman, that is Lily Rogers. So you can see she's in the first entry, and there are a few other entries for her down the form. I started by checking the admission record because there was only 1 of those, and here it is. It shows Lily Rogers entering the workhouse. She's second from the bottom in the list of names, and she's admitted on the 19th of August 1919. And you can see that with her is an infant named Daisy, who I assume is her daughter. We can see that 20-year-old Lily usually works as a servant, and she's also recorded as a single woman. We can see that because in the column marked condition, we can see that there's an S. You'll also notice in this image, there's a section of the register which is marked class of diet. Great attention was paid in the workhouse to what class of diet people should be on. And many poor law boards issued published schedules of what was in each class of diet. The reason for this is that the cost of food was immense for the workhouses, and they wanted to make sure that people got the energy they needed, the food they needed, but that they weren't giving food that they didn't need. So this record tells us when Lily entered the workhouse, and so I'm obviously interested what the discharge record might tell me. I picked up next the first of the 2 discharge records that I found on my search list. This is a record of Lily and Daisy leaving the workhouse into the care of somebody called Miss May. But there's a snag here because this entry is dated Tuesday the 29th of July, which is prior to the admission record that I just showed you. On discharge, Daisy would have only been about 26 days old, which made me wonder if she might have been born in the workhouse. So I searched again using the general search form, which looked right across all the LMA collections, to see if I could pick up an earlier admission. And I did find one. And this is a record for Lily. Again, she's near the bottom of the list of names. And also what's entered is she's admitted with a female child, and it looks like the name Daisy may have been added later. In this record, Lily is classified as destitute, so she's got no home and she's got no income, despite the fact having previously been employed as a servant. So this left me just with this last hit that I had for Lily on my original search, and I've highlighted it here. It's this discharge record of her going out on the 23rd of October 1919. And here is that last record. So she's a bit further up the list this time. In this discharge record, Daisy Rogers' birth date corresponds with the date her mum entered the workhouse. So I think we can be pretty clear that she was born there. And I'm wondering if this discrepancy between the 2nd or the 3rd just means that she was perhaps born around midnight between the two, and you know, they just it was a case of getting that information down rather quickly. We already know that they were previously discharged into the care of someone called Miss May on the 29th of July, but it seems that things didn't go well for them, so they went back into the workhouse on the 19th of August, and then they finally left here on Thursday, October the 23rd, and it says that Lily was discharged and Daisy was discharged too, to the care of her mother, so the care of her mother, Lily. But I think there's a bigger picture here that to be gleaned from the information that I found in these registers. You'll recall that I wasn't looking for Lily as an ancestor, but for an interesting case to talk about. What I found was the story of a young woman whose circumstances would have been very familiar to the workhouse staff. So what we have here is a glimpse more generally into the lives of single pregnant women in London at this time. I'm left wondering who this Miss May was, perhaps someone known to the authorities for taking in young women in need. Clearly, it might be possible to find more examples of such cases. I did look quickly to see if I could see Miss May taking in anybody else. I didn't, but I did find other ladies referred to. There was a Miss Edwards who took in a young woman, and other people named in similar ways. It clearly might be possible to find more information, and I think it would take a good trawl through more registers, or even going back to the board minutes to see if anybody has mentioned the names of these ladies and recommended them as being able to offer their services. So what we've seen in these examples is what we might find in general workhouse admission and discharge registers. There would have been separate infirmary registers, and for older children who were sent to residential homes, there would be other registers too. So there can be duplication across different kinds of admission records. In general, however, we find that almost everyone who entered the workhouse system would have had their admission recorded in a general admission and discharge register. One other type of admission record is worth a special mention, and that's the Religious Creed Register. From 1868, workhouse authorities were required to keep a record of the religious creed of everyone they admitted. The main aim was that people's needs for particular religious observances could be catered for. These were working documents, organised alphabetically or indexed in order to be able to look people up when necessary. As archival sources, therefore, they are the gold standard for anyone looking for an individual by name. For reasons that are not entirely clear, they also happen to have more detail about a person than you might expect. So don't worry about this slightly florid handwriting in this creed register, which is from Hackney Union Workhouse, which was in Homerton, and it's from 1910. Because we can see from the column headings just how much you can find out about the people that were recorded in it. It's not just their name, date, and religion that's recorded, but where they were admitted from, and when, and their marital status, or in the case of children, whether they were legitimate or illegitimate. In this example, you'll see that even the name, address, and relationship of the nearest known relative or friend is recorded. In many respects, you can see that the creed register contains more information than the general admission register, and that's what makes them so valuable. So now I'm going to move on to the last category of records that I'm going to introduce to you today. You'll recall that your right of claim to poor relief, including admission to the workhouse, was dependent on which parish accepted your right of settlement. Disputes over this were common, and it was down to the poor law authorities to make judgments over who they should provide for and who they should remove to other parishes. This image is of our selected collection of poor law removal and settlement records on ancestry.co.uk. I should point out that in the Browse This Collection panel, you can see that there's only 9 areas of London represented in this collection at present. That's useful to know, but it also shows you the additional information that you can find in the Browse the Collection panels. If I clicked into any one of those areas like Holborn or Hackney, I'd be able to browse through these records rather than search them. I'd be able to actually look at them as if I had the records in front of me, which can be very useful and a different way of using them. Similarly, what's included in each record can vary very widely, but we know that it often includes the name and age of all family members, occupations, place of residence, both current residence when the document was created and former residences, and finally, the situation of people that people are finding themselves in, and the grounds for settlement or removal are often recorded in some detail. So I've got 2 examples of settlement records to show you now. Firstly, here we have an order of removal from the parish of St Leonard's, Shoreditch, which concerns the case of 8-year-old Leonora Richards, and this is from 1802. Leonora is described as having been abandoned by her father James after her mother died, and this removal order is the result of the parish overseers seeking a judgment on her case from the Middlesex Justices of the Peace. It seems like the child was living locally before coming to the attention of the overseers, but the justices determined that although she had come to inhabit in the parish of St Leonard's, she had not gained any legal right of settlement there. This order goes on to issue an instruction to the church wardens and overseers of St Leonard's to remove and convey Leonora to the parish of New Windsor in Berkshire, where she apparently had legal settlement, and where there would be an obligation to care for her. In this case, it is possible, therefore, that the ongoing story of this child's early life could be in the Berkshire Poor Law records. The second example I've got is of a settlement examination. Settlement examinations were undertaken when there was a question about whether somebody had the right to appeal to a particular authority for help. This one is also from 1802, and it's also from St Leonard's, Shoreditch. This is the case of Maria Richards and her two children, 4.5-year-old William and an unnamed daughter of 4 months who has not yet been baptised. Maria's husband William, who she married in a church other than St Leonard's, Shoreditch, is in debtor's prison. Maria has no means of support, and she's given up the rented rooms in which they made their home. She has no option but to turn to the parish for relief. Now, it may be significant that Maria is trying to prove that her husband rented property before becoming bankrupt. In trying to secure a settlement for herself and her children. This is because the formal rental of property within a parish area has the potential to qualify a person for settlement there. Just a word about Maria's unbaptized and curiously unnamed daughter and why this might be mentioned. It's obviously important because this child's fate depends on whether her mother is accepted as eligible for help from St Leonard's or not. I'm not accusing Maria of lying, but if her child had in fact been baptized elsewhere, that would have complicated her claim for relief from St Leonard's significantly. We know that Maria and William weren't married at St Leonard's. They were married in Westminster. But this is a woman in dire straits. It's just curious, I think, that the child is actually unnamed. That might be because she's unofficially, she hasn't got an official name yet. But if I was a very strict parish clerk, I would be tempted to try and just check whether this child had been baptized anywhere else, because it does have a bearing on Maria's claim for settlement. So we're now near the end of my talk. And as I sum up, I'm leaving you with the web address for our catalogue and for the LMA collections homepage on ancestry.co.uk. These are the best places to continue with your exploration of the London Poor Law sources and the many other collections which we hold at LMA. In this introduction to our poor law holdings, I hope that I've given you a sense that the records of the parish overseers and the London Board of Guardians can tell us much more than just the details of individuals who went into the workhouse. Certainly, these bodies clothed and fed the poor and the needy, aided the survival of lone mothers and their babies, and provided a secure later life for people who were older, like Mr. Smith. But these records can also be used to explore the wider history of why such services have long been considered an essential element of British society.